Hey, everybody. It is Monday, February 3rd. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Manunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to all weekend long, all night long. Jill, it's been nonstop with the headlines this weekend.
Yeah, just when we thought it was safe, we were out of January. We were smooth sailing in February. Nope. Back to back headlines.
Yeah, a lot related to the government, the Trump administration, various moves, people getting locked out of the government over the weekend, losing their jobs, a lot happening. Jill, on a personal note, sort of important heads up for folks, I will be turning 43 this year. And so today I'll be getting my first colonoscopy. I know personal information, but I feel like it's important for people to know because rates are higher these days among younger people. I have a family history of it. A couple of my grandparents had colon cancer. And so making a point, typically they say start at 45. I'm starting a bit earlier here. And so just a heads up, as we've seen increasing rates, we've talked about it, go get checked out, especially on the early side, if you have a family history of it.
Yes, and I have an underlying stomach condition. And so I have had many colonoscopies in my life, which is why I gently reminded you that we should probably record on the earlier end if you were going to be doing some prep.
Without going into further details.
We'll leave it there.
We're recording on Sunday afternoon, but we'll update accordingly throughout the evening as necessary.
All right, let's get to the news here. Starting with the biggest story this weekend is a trade war brewing between the United States and its closest allies. President Trump officially orders steep tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China effective this week. And those countries are scrambling to push back.
Jill, this was a huge headline over the weekend, the president following through with his threat. We'll break down how everyone is reacting around the world.
Plus, mass firings, government employees locked out of their computer systems, and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency gaining access to sensitive data. Trump's overhaul of the federal government has begun with Musk at the helm.
They're moving very quickly.
Over at the FBI, the Trump administration fires prosecutors involved in the January 6th cases and moves toward ousting other FBI agents. Plus, another tragic plane crash, this time in Philadelphia. A medical ambulance crashes in a Philadelphia neighborhood, killing 7. And we have an update on the D.C. collision last Wednesday between an American Airlines plane and a U.S. Army helicopter. The third Army pilot involved in the crash has been identified, and the black box was recovered. On the opposite coast, federal officials opened up 2 California dams as Donald Trump insists that they'll provide relief for the wildfires in Los Angeles, even as officials say that the water source is not connected to Southern California.
Yeah, this move had a bunch of people scratching their heads this weekend.
And in international news, 3 more hostages are released from Gaza, including an American, over the weekend. While today officially begins what officials expect to be rocky negotiations for the second phase of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement. And in much lighter news, Punxsutawney Phil versus Staten Island Chuck. Who saw their shadow? And how many more weeks of winter can we expect?
Jill, dozens of groundhogs were out yesterday. They all have various track records. We will look at the numbers and figure out who we should believe.
Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
The day the music died on this day.
Okay, we're going to start with what looks to be the start of a trade war between the United States and its 2 closest allies and neighbors, Canada and Mexico. President Trump on Saturday signed an order to impose stiff tariffs on imports from Mexico, Canada, and China as well. He declared an economic emergency in order to place tariffs of 10% on all imports from China and 25% on imports from Mexico and Canada. There is one exception regarding Canada, that is for energy, including oil, natural gas, and electricity. So as opposed to 25%, energy will be taxed at a 10% rate. Trump said the tariffs are necessary to, quote, protect Americans. He's pressing the 3 countries to do more to curb the manufacturing and export of illicit fentanyl, and for Canada and Mexico to reduce illegal immigration into the United States. But the president has not laid out specifically what the countries need to do. The move drew swift retaliation and also a sense of betrayal from the United States' North American neighbors as a trade war erupted amongst the longtime allies. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in a somber tone Saturday night, said it didn't have to be this way, as he announced that his country would be putting matching 25% tariffs on up to $155 billion in U.S. imports, and that includes alcohol and fruit. So take a listen to a bit of what Trudeau had to say on Saturday night.
From the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of the Korean Peninsula, from the fields of Flanders to the streets of Kandahar, we have fought and died alongside you. During your darkest hours, during the Iranian hostage crisis, those 444 days we worked around the clock from our embassy to get your innocent compatriots home. During the summer of 2005, when Hurricane Katrina ravaged your great city of New Orleans, or mere weeks ago, when we sent water bombers to tackle the wildfires in California. During the day the world stood still, September 11th, 2001, when we provided refuge to stranded passengers and planes, we were always there, standing with you, grieving with you, the American people.
Jill, Trudeau trying to make a point that Canada, for more than a century, has been by America's side, and saying that regardless of differences, this was not the way to go. And even went so far as to say what Trump is doing here breaks all agreements and will make Canada and other countries reluctant to work with the U.S. in the future.
Trudeau says the tariffs are not the way to work out differences, and he even told his citizens to avoid American products and even avoid vacationing in America. Mexico's president also ordering retaliatory tariffs. Claudia Sheinbaum saying, quote, "We categorically reject the White House's slander that the Mexican government has alliances with criminal organizations, as well as any intention of meddling in our territory." The three countries, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, do at least $2 trillion in trade annually. So the tariffs would basically charge any importers a 25% tax on all of those items. And normally those charges then get passed on to consumers, which means that hundreds of billions of dollars in goods from Canada, from lumber to minerals to auto parts to machinery to maple syrup, you name it, will all likely go up. Same goes for Mexico. For example, avocados. We get about 90% of ours from Mexico, plus other major produce, as well as auto parts, medical devices, cars, electronics. So again, the same goes there. The tariffs would drive up costs for the importers, and those costs would likely get passed on to consumers. If sustained, the tariffs could cause inflation to get a lot worse, despite the president's campaign promise to lower the cost of groceries, gasoline, housing, autos, and other goods. Meanwhile, in China, the Commerce Ministry said that it would file a legal case against the United States at the World Trade Organization and vowed to also take corresponding countermeasures. Notably, the tariffs would impact items of all prices. There is typically an exception for less expensive items that are under $800, but this tariff would affect everything. So that means look out for all of those items from Temu and Shein, among others, to be impacted here. Responding to the announcement of tariffs, the president of the United Auto Workers Union said that he backed the use of tariffs to protect American jobs, but not to achieve non-economic policy goals. The union president, Shawn Fain, saying that the government should use tariffs to preserve U.S. manufacturing jobs, prevent plant closures, and compel Canada and Mexico to renegotiate the North American Trade Agreement that was last amended during the first Trump administration. But he also said he opposed using tariffs as leverage for non-economic issues, which the Trump administration is also raising in this trade war with Canada and Mexico. He says, "We do not support using factory workers as pawns in a fight over immigration or drug policy." Donald Trump, though, defending the move on social media over the weekend, writing, quote, "We pay hundreds of billions of dollars to subsidize Canada Why? There is no reason. We don't need anything they have. We have unlimited energy, should make our own cars, and have more lumber than we can ever use. Without this massive subsidy, Canada ceases to exist as a viable country. Harsh, but true. Therefore, Canada should become our cherished 51st state, much lower taxes and far better military protection for the people of Canada. And then he wrote in caps, and no tariffs. Moshe, a lot to digest here. So what do we make of all of this? What does he mean by subsidizing Canada?
So he hasn't really clarified. We all presume what he means is the trade deficit we have with Canada. The bottom line is the U.S. imports more from Canada than Canada imports from the U.S., which he refers to subsidize. The deficit is about $45 billion, as in we buy $45 billion more than the Canadians buy from us. Effectively, the difference there is the oil we buy from Canada because of the amount of oil we need, the oil that we refine here. We bring in oil from Canada. At the end of the day here, more than 75% of Canadian exports go to the U.S. So I think that's what Trump is referring to here and why Trump believes he has a lot of leverage here with Canada. But the bigger issue here that I think surprised people, despite the tariff threats, is that he went through with this, at least so far. And tariffs are typically used against adversaries or, in the cases of allies, used to protect very specific industries after a lot of negotiation. They're typically, like, for example, until this weekend, and until these ones are implemented on Tuesday, we've had about a 14% tariff on Canadian lumber, trying to help our industry here in the U.S. That now goes up to 25%. We've had other tariffs on the Chinese and other countries, again, trying to protect U.S. companies so other countries can't dump a bunch of cheap products here on the U.S., thereby hurting American jobs. Now, the way Trump is using tariffs here is very different. Now, he promised during the campaign, I'm going to do this. He said it repeatedly. He literally said, and we played this on the podcast, I think tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. It's more beautiful than love, and I'm going to use a lot of it. He thinks a trade war is a good thing. Mexico is our largest trading partner. Canada is our second largest trading partner. The way he's using tariffs here is just his basic leverage, not to protect certain industries, but ultimately what he's trying to do here and say, I'm going to do tariffs, so I get you to do other stuff on fentanyl, on the border. Now, he hasn't been very specific on what it would take to lift these tariffs. He's speaking very generically. We have about 100,000 fentanyl deaths in America every year. Does it need to go to zero for him to lift this? Are there certain thresholds here? Keep in mind that fentanyl from Canada is not a major issue. About 0.02% of fentanyl that comes in the country is estimated to come from Canada. We have a domestic issue here, and we have much cheaper drug coming from the cartels in Mexico. So, nonetheless, Trump is moving forward with this. The Canadians and the Mexicans and the Chinese were not acquiescing this weekend. They had harsh words back, and they said, it takes two to tango here. Now, we should keep in mind that the economies in Canada and Mexico much smaller than the U.S. Their combined GDP in Canada and Mexico, 1/7 of the U.S. GDP. The tariffs do risk now pushing Canada and Mexico into recession. Again, both nations send about 75 to 80% of their exports to America. The dollar, the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, likely to be hurt here. And again, that's why Trump is doing this. He goes, this is going to hurt you more than it hurts me, even though it will hurt the U.S. That's something Trump acknowledged on Friday to media that he had in the Oval Office. Now, Mexico and Canada specifically are retaliating against red states. Canadians joked, it's like the most Canadian thing possible to be like, we're only going to hurt the people that voted for Trump. But specifically, they're trying to hurt the people who voted for Trump because they're hoping that Trump will feel that backlash, that Republicans in Congress will feel that backlash. And so specifically, you had the premier out in British Columbia say, we're going to remove all American alcohol with a focus on bourbon from Kentucky and make Americans feel the pinch here. So prices will go up here in the U.S. because the way, as you explained, tariffs work is that the importers who bring in stuff typically pass along the costs of those taxes, of the tariffs, to the consumer. And this will go across the board. 30% of our lumber comes from Canada. Ultimately, that will be passed on to home buyers in the form of increased housing prices. If you're doing home renovations, beware. I heard from woodworkers who are like, I work with maple and various wood from Canada. Like, I'm scared this is going to put me out of business. Car prices could go up significantly, not just 25%, but more than that. Mexico supplied 42% of U.S. auto parts last year. Canada supplied 13%. The way these economies are very interwoven is very challenging. And even though Trump's goal here is to boost American manufacturing, that'll take years or decades, if ever, for everything to come here. And ultimately, the way that cars go back across the border and parts travel back and forth, they travel sometimes back and forth between the countries several times before they eventually make it here to the U.S., which means tariff costs could surge well above 25%. Because remember, he's not doing any exceptions here for, down to even $1. And so you mentioned the United Auto Workers statement. I'm seeing statements, we posted it on our premium Instagram account throughout the weekend, from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the largest business lobby, saying, yeah, we don't agree with this. The timber industry, the apparel industry, the pharmaceutical industry. They said, we're eager to work with Trump here, but typically, tariffs have excluded medications and medical parts. And so you could see an increase in the price of various medications here. These are groups, some of these groups have been very friendly to Trump here. Jill, I heard from a major, he asked me to keep him anonymous, but a major American apparel company, you would recognize their stores in almost every shopping mall in America, who's like, yeah, we're about to raise all of our prices between $5 and $20 on many items due to the tariff specifically on China here. So a lot of moving parts right now.
Moshe, you mentioned Canada and Mexico retaliating here. We should note Trump's executive order on tariffs includes a clause that will allow the U.S. to raise tariffs even further if Mexico or Canada retaliates. It's unclear what number it would go up to. There is some history here for our neighbors. Retaliation worked in 2018 when Mexico responded to U.S. tariffs on steel with tariffs of its own that included steel, pork, cheese, apples, and bourbon. The U.S. eventually backed down. Now, as for what's next, how long the tariffs will last is unclear. The White House said they would remain in place, quote, until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country.
Right. Is a zero tolerance policy sort of unrealistic? What is the bar? I imagine it will happen in private negotiations. I was watching an interview with the Canadian finance minister over the weekend where he says he's pretty pessimistic right now about this ending within a couple of weeks. He thinks there might be an opening in March based on his conversation with U.S. officials, reinforcing, again, less than 1% of fentanyl in the U.S. has ever been sourced to Canada. But 1% is 1% too much. And if they want to work with us, if they want to do more here on the border, and the Canadians, we should note, have increased the border patrols, have said they did, they've done more here, as have the Mexicans in recent weeks, taking in deportees, etc. But not enough here for Trump. And that's why the Canadian finance minister wonders, is this a pretext for a larger policy objective? And you read that quote from Trump earlier, I want Canada to be the 51st state. And he did say recently he's going to exert economic pressure to try to get Canada to force them to join America here. And so that's what the Canadians are sort of getting at, is there a larger purpose here? Is this really about fentanyl, Donald Trump? What is interesting, Jill, is we've talked about the local chaos in Canada recently between the Liberals, Trudeau resigning, or at least not running for re-election, the Conservatives on the rise there. But this is united all Canadians. I was struck by the statement by the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, in Canada over the weekend. He writes, and by the way, he's been sympathetic to Donald Trump. He comes from the right end of the spectrum. He's the likely next prime minister here of Canada. He writes, we must put Canada first. That is why common sense Conservatives condemn President Trump's massive, unjust, and unjustified tariffs on Canada's already weak economy. Canada is the United States' closest neighbor, greatest ally, best friend. There is no justification whatsoever for this treatment. And in hearing from members of the Mo News Committee from Canada, just, shock that this is going down. They're like, China tariffs, fine. A lot of other countries, fine. But you're picking on us? We are more than amenable to work with you guys, as we always have. So a lot of shock there, Jill. The one thing I'll be watching closely, Wall Street this week. If the markets react, when the markets react to this, that is something that Trump is very sensitive to. And if there's a feeling that this is going to lower GDP, slow economic growth, and we start to see major market impact, that could be something here that forces Trump to cut this sooner, declare victory on some sort of deal, because he's kept it very vague, right? So he could just be like, the Canadians have now agreed to this, the Mexicans have agreed to this, tariffs have been successful, they're dropped. But again, it's too early to say as we record this on Sunday afternoon.
And if only that was the big news of the weekend.
Yeah, sticking with more things out of Washington.
It has been a tumultuous weekend inside a number of agencies in the U.S. government as the Trump administration, led by billionaire and Trump ally Elon Musk, have embarked on their promise to remake the federal government through lightning-quick takeovers, potentially massive cuts, and locking out thousands of people from the government systems. They also took down a number of websites and social media accounts this weekend. We've really never seen anything like this before. Musk shut out senior government workers and took control of key workflows in the Office of Personnel Management. So that's the OPM, you may have heard it referred to as. It functions as the government's human resources agency. They manage policies, payments, recruitment, and labor relations for about 2 million federal workers. Aides to Musk have locked career civil servants out of important computer systems that contain personal information for millions of federal employees. And as we reported on this podcast, it comes just a few days after an email was sent to the 2.3 million federal workers last Tuesday, offering them a deal to resign with pay for 8 months. On Friday, Musk visited the OPM offices and installed many of his longtime allies in senior leadership roles there.
Yeah, this very much mimics his takeover of Twitter, having people sleep there on couches, taking over systems. In some cases, and we'll tell you about this in a moment, like fighting with security guards there in order to access systems. A reminder, Musk was originally picked to lead DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency here. It's not a real thing in terms of a congressionally mandated department, but it's just sort of an agency that Trump has set up here. And the idea was to make recommendations for cuts to the government with a 2-year goal. Forget 2 years. In less than 2 weeks here, they've made major moves inside the government, trying to get access to key systems. Most of you have never heard of OPM before, but it's the HR agency that manages basically all the pension payments, all the pay. It's HR for the entire federal government. He's also gotten his folks into the General Services Administration. You've probably never heard of the GSA unless you work in the government. They manage all the real estate for the U.S. government. And then there's various other agencies that he has sent his folks to. And it comes again as they sent out multiple notes now calling on more than 1 million federal workers to potentially take this payout to leave the government without really specific targeting around certain positions. That's why there are concerns that, ultimately if too many people take stuff from certain departments, that basically will make those departments dysfunctional, right? Typically, if you work in a private organization, you're trying to do certain cuts, you might try to be strategic there. They're going across the board here, across most agencies. The mentality here, as it was at Twitter when he took it over before he renamed it X, cut as many jobs as possible first, then figure out what to do next.
Mind you, Elon Musk doesn't get paid for any of this, by the way.
No, he's just advising the president, and it's not clear whether he even takes a salary. He's also the richest man in the world, worth more than $400 billion. But ultimately here has been given certain keys to the kingdom and is in the process of getting more keys, literally building by building in D.C. right now.
Right. Also on Friday, Musk and his deputies at DOGE were given access to a secure Treasury Department system that gives out trillions of dollars in U.S. government payments. The payment system is usually controlled by a very small number of career officials. And that's because it deals with a lot of people's very sensitive personal information. It includes about $6 trillion toward things like Social Security and Medicare benefits, salaries for federal employees, payments to government contractors and grant recipients, and tax refunds, among many other things. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent approved the DOGE's access last week after the highest-ranking official at the department was pushed out. The former official had been serving in a non-political role for decades there, but he resigned Friday after a rift with Musk because he had denied him access to the system. So Musk and his team now have at their disposal a tool to monitor and potentially limit government spending for things that they do not approve of or could face legal hurdles. It potentially allows him to cut off payment or use funds for whatever he wants. On Saturday, Musk criticized the Treasury on X or Twitter, saying that they should be rejecting more payments that are deemed fraudulent or improper. The top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, condemned DOGE's access to this system. He pointed out the potential conflict of interests in allowing Musk transparency into payments for government contractors and grants that benefit companies that compete with Musk's own vast portfolio.
Yeah, there's huge conflict of interest potential issues here, given the various companies Musk has, the government contracts that he has. Doge teams have started to demand access to data and systems at federal agencies. Of course, you just mentioned Treasury, which controls the flow of money here. Musk didn't stop there. On Saturday, 2 top security officials over at USAID were put on administrative leave. Thousands of others look like they may have lost their job at effectively the world's leading humanitarian donor. If you haven't heard of USAID, it is a $40 billion a year budget agency, more than 10,000 employees, administering billions of dollars in humanitarian development and security assistance around the world to more than 100 countries. It's been around since JFK through Democrats and Republicans. The idea Trump has had, going back to his first term, was to fold it into the State Department. But during the first term, Trump tried to follow normal procedures because at the end of the day, Congress is in charge of either adding government agencies or removing government agencies and reorging things. Well, it got held up by Congress last time. So what you're seeing this time is effectively Musk and being given a complete green light to do whatever he can and basically saying to folks, stop me. Try to stop me. Literally, they tried to at USAID. Doge officials on Saturday night tried to gain access to headquarters. They were stopped. They threatened to call the U.S. Marshals to be allowed in. The Doge officials did eventually gain access to classified information there. They have now put on leave those security officials and a number of USAID officials. Jill, on Sunday, USAID, the website, disappeared along with all of its data. Their social media handles gone. Musk writing, USAID is a criminal organization. Time for it to die. That's what he wrote on X over the weekend. Trump, when he first got in, froze basically all foreign aid funding. This includes malaria nets in Africa, AIDS help, HIV meds that we give out around the world. You know, people at USAID telling me, like, people literally are going to die if they haven't already, due to the decisions here to just freeze everything across the board without vetting it first. And there are people who are sympathetic to Trump here, saying, listen, is there waste? Yes. Should we cut programs? Probably. Is this the way to do it? I mean, literally, there's aid on shipments right now headed towards countries around the world. And the Trump team has now deleted these people's email addresses and fired all of them. Who's going to take that stuff? Unclear. There are countries around the world now that are very upset. They haven't been given a heads up that we are cutting these various aid programs basically overnight here. The Trump folks saying, again, stuff didn't work the first term. They're going basically lightning speed here. The big question I've been asked over the weekend, is this legal? Jill, I don't know. I think they're sort of like, stop us if you want to, stop us if you can. Congress, remember, House and Senate run by Republicans, majority Republicans. I imagine there will be lawsuits here in terms of how things are done, saying they broke procedure, broke current laws. So a lot could unfold here, but a weekend where literally it was described to me by one government official. They were having like a Zoom where they were talking to the boss about like, wait, what's happening here? And people started disappearing off the Zoom as their connectivity, emails, and accounts started to get deleted by the Musk team.
So, Moshe, I know that for Harris supporters and for a lot of Democrats and even for some Republicans who were kind of like the never Trumpers, there was a lot of trepidation about what a second Trump term could look like. A lot was made about Project 2025. So is this kind of like their worst case scenario here? So it looks like he's basically doing what a lot of his non-supporters had feared that he would.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is out of the Project 2025 textbook, the report that came out. But Jill, during the campaign trail, as he reported, he promised to blow up government. He said everything was broken. He says that a lot of these places are wasteful, that these agencies shouldn't exist. The question, of course, is what guardrails exist to handle this in a different manner. And Trump discovered in his first term that he felt government officials, these longtime, career government workers, stopped him from doing this last time. And so this time around, he's going to get rid of as many as possible as quickly as he can. And if he can't, make life hell for them so they leave. Right. So he's offered this buyout. They're doing this stuff over the weekend, creating this fear, literally taking the signs off the wall. They're repainting the walls of the FBI with messages that they don't like. I think there was one that had the word diversity on it. Literally a photo came out over the weekend of them painting over that word. So there's a lot happening here. But again, I should say for Trump supporters, of which I was speaking to over the weekend. Some have some consternation, being like, I don't like the process here, but that's sort of Trump. And some saying, yeah, government's broken, and that's the approach they're taking. And they're very much, it's a very Silicon Valley-esque approach, or I should say Elon Musk approach here, which is move fast, break things, and figure it out later.
And that also brings us to some changes at the Department of Health and Human Services over the weekend. The Trump administration appeared to scrub all information related to LGBTQ health from the CDC website. So those sites now just say CDC's website is being modified to comply with President Trump's executive orders. That's referring to Trump's orders to end all programs that use taxpayer money to promote gender ideology. Additionally, a page for recommended vaccines was temporarily unavailable over the weekend, but then returned on Saturday. Although without mention of the Mpox vaccine. The Mpox vaccine is recommended for gay and bisexual men, plus transgender and non-binary people, among others. The CDC's main HIV page was also temporarily down and restored. Also missing from the CDC website, information about sexual health, STIs, and contraceptives. Doctors rely on CDC guidelines to know how to treat their patients. Why this matters? Doctors rely on CDC guidelines to know how to treat their patients, including what tests to run and antibiotics to use for each type of infection.
Yeah, we had doctors reach out to us over the weekend. They were basically trying to save data from the CDC website before it was taken down. An OBGYN who in the Mo News community saying physicians rely on this data, that doctors were frantically downloading this, that she knows, trying to share the information on social media, that some of these categories that Trump considers DEI, that there's actual differences in how people are impacted by various drugs or illnesses, and that data is important in terms of keeping people safe. But nonetheless here, just a lot happening this weekend. And you did see a response from Democrats on Capitol Hill. Again, they have no real power over there, concerned about all of this. The big question is, will Republicans on the Hill react? We saw that last week, right? Sort of behind the scenes after it came out, they gave basically the entire government 18 hours to cut all federal contracts. Republicans behind the scenes were like, yeah, this is not the way to do stuff because of the way they're moving quickly. So we'll see what comes of everything that transpired here over the weekend. But Jill, a genuine concern among people who have lives and families who work in the U.S. government who are like, I don't know what's happening.
All right, time for the speed read. Back to Washington. This from CBS News. The Justice Department has directed Washington, D.C.'s top prosecutor to fire any prosecutor involved in investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol, effective immediately. At least 8 senior executives from the FBI have been forced to retire, or they'll be fired by today. That is most of the Bureau's top officials. Multiple heads at FBI field offices were also let go, along with more than 24 federal prosecutors who worked on January 6th related cases. The active Deputy Attorney General also ordered an investigation into thousands of federal FBI agents who may have been involved in litigation related to January 6th. They'll be forced to undergo a review and potentially face the chopping block. According to a memo, these people are getting let go because they have hindered the ability of the D.C. U.S. Attorney to implement the agenda that the American people elected Trump to execute. Many executive assistant directors who lead critical national security, cyber, and criminal divisions are being forced to resign, retire, or could be fired.
Yeah, this is revenge for Jan 6, revenge for the investigations. We should note in a number of these cases, these people were assigned to these cases as part of their job at the FBI. And again, the January 6 cases, there were more than 1,500 prosecutions, including people who assaulted police officers, etc. But now you see this overhaul happening even before you have a confirmed FBI director. We told you about Kash Patel's hearing last week, but they're already moving on this before this, or at least they tried to over the weekend. We'll see what happens next year, because the acting FBI director, Brian Driscoll, apparently resisted this order over the weekend to assist in firing agents. Some think, and by the time you listen to this podcast, he might be fired for having resisted it. But this all comes after Trump pardoned more than 1,600 people convicted of charges related to January 6th. And this could affect thousands of FBI agents who worked on related investigations related to January 6th here. We will potentially see a Senate confirmation of Kash Patel here, and we'll see what sort of FBI he's inheriting, and or whether anyone in Congress, particularly on the Republican side, hits pause on this or has questions on this before voting to confirm him, given what we saw unfold, but you can expect potentially more firings, more resignations at the FBI today and in the coming days.
From the Associated Press, sadly, we're tracking a second plane crash that happened last week. This time it was a small Learjet that crashed in Philadelphia Friday night. So this was an air ambulance, meaning that it was taking a patient from the hospital. All 6 people on board, a pilot and co-pilot, 2 medical personnel, a patient and her mother, died in that crash on Friday, and then 1 person in a car on the ground was also killed. Authorities are still trying to figure out what caused the crash. Carrying 6 people from Mexico, including a child who spent months in treatment at the hospital, this Learjet went down just after departing from the Northeast Philadelphia airport, creating what witnesses described as a massive fireball, shaking houses and leaving a chaotic street scene. The plane took off, reaching about 1,500 feet of altitude, and then plummeted in a steep descent. It crashed less than a minute after takeoff. The National Transportation Safety Board chair called it a high-impact crash that left the plane highly fragmented.
Yeah, tragic incident there, given the circumstances. Sadly, there are several hundred small plane crashes every year in the U.S., but it is very rare for it to happen in an urban setting like Philadelphia. And of course, it comes on the heels of the collision over D.C. Last week. Speaking of which, they have now recovered the black boxes from both the plane and the helicopter that were part of that collision just outside Reagan National Airport Wednesday night. On Sunday, a very emotional scene as family members of the plane crash victims visited the crash site. Dozens of victims' loved ones could be seen gathered by the river there to commemorate the 67 people killed. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers has released a timeline for removing the jet and the helicopter wreckage from the river. Salvage operations will begin today. They're expected to take several days here, initially with the plane, then with the helicopter. It does come as they continue to look for bodies, and they don't believe they can find all of them until they are able to salvage the wreckage here. There's still over 20 people who were killed in the collision whose bodies have not been found yet. The NTSB investigator, one of the focuses of the investigation right now is why the chopper was up at 325 feet at the time of the collision. It was supposed to be under a ceiling of 200 feet, effectively. It's supposed to be flying lower than that. It does come as we did get the identities of all 3 pilots over the weekend. That includes Captain Rebecca Lobach. She was a star ROTC student, graduated from UNC. She had wanted to attend medical school after her Army service. She had 500 hours of flying time, 250 flights, which is a higher end for a captain. Just tragic as we continue to learn the identities of the various people killed in the collision here. It does come as we continue to get more concerning data about the level of air traffic control staffing in the country. Data over the weekend shows that 90% of the country's 313 air traffic control facilities operate below staffing levels recommended by the FAA. So that's 285 facilities of the 313 that are below levels. In 73 of the facilities, at least a quarter of the workforce is missing. I imagine that'll be among the many things that comes out of this. That was the subject of a special episode we put out over the weekend on this podcast, on all the podcasts, actually, given the feedback we got on it. It's an interview I did with Peter Greenberg, travel editor for CBS News, who's steeped in this stuff. So if you're looking for a deep dive into all things air traffic control, plane safety in the country, check out the episode before this one in the feed.
All right, now to the West Coast from the LA Times. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has dramatically increased the amount of water flowing from 2 dams in Tulare County, California, sending massive flows down river channels toward farmlands in the San Joaquin Valley. It isn't clear what the goal is here because this water doesn't flow to Southern California, which was decimated by the fires. So again, not really clear where federal officials intended to send the water that was being released from the dams. Local water managers say they were caught off guard by the federal government's plan. State officials, they say, were not part of the decision-making to release water from the federal reservoirs. The 2 reservoirs are used to hold supplies for agricultural irrigation districts. Officials note that winter is not the irrigation season for farms, which require more supplies to grow crops in the summer months. So they say there really isn't a demand for that water. In fact, local officials say that the farmers were counting on that water to be available for summer irrigation.
Yeah, people scratching their heads out there in California. Trump writing on True Social, celebrating this, saying, photo of beautiful water flow that I opened in California. Today, 1.6 billion gallons. In 3 days, 5.2 billion gallons. Everyone should be happy about this long-fought victory. I only wish they listened to me 6 years ago. There would have been no fire, he claims, exclamation point. Trump trying to prove a point here, optics. Again, we've told you this. The fires in Southern California, there was one reservoir that needed to be rebuilt down there, but there's no connection between Northern California and Southern California related to these dams. And ultimately, the issue they faced was not a lack of water in Southern California, but a lack of water pressure in the hydrants, as they basically turned on every hydrant in a number of these towns. So the Army Corps says they were releasing the water to ensure California has water available to respond to wildfires. But again, it's not clear where this water went or how they were capturing this water. State officials, local officials saying, we normally coordinate this sort of thing. Where is this water going? What was the point of all of this? One local official there says he's been working for 20 years. He's never seen anything like this. Another water scientist who deals with dam managers there say that they only release large quantities when major storms need to make room for large inflows. But Southern California has been very dry. The snowpack and the Southern Sierra Mountains remains below average here. So there's no indication why these releases occurred here. And so strange, disturbing. A number of the quotes that you see coming out of that move, again, it appears to have been for optics purposes, but unclear, again, where this water is going.
Okay, overseas from the New York Times, Hamas released 3 more Israeli hostages, and Israel freed 183 Palestinian prisoners Saturday as part of this ongoing ceasefire deal. So Hamas released Yarden Bibas, Ofer Calderon, and American-Israeli Keith Siegel in highly performative ceremonies, including, once again, giving them gift bags and making them write thank you letters to the terror group after being held hostage for more than 15 months. That is more than 480 days. The freed hostages headed to hospitals in Israel where they were being reunited with their families and began to receive medical care. The exchange was the 4th in a multi-phase ceasefire deal that Israel and Hamas agreed to last month. Under the deal, Hamas pledged to free at least 33 of the 97 remaining hostages over the first 6 weeks in exchange for more than 1,500 Palestinians jailed by Israel. So far, 10 hostages have been returned. Hamas has said that of the remaining 23 that are set to go home as part of this first phase, 15 are alive without offering specifics on the conditions of individuals, and that 8 are dead, and Hamas not naming which of the hostages are living.
Yeah, the return here for Israelis in particular, pretty bittersweet, especially for Yarden Bibas, the father. He's 35 years old. His wife, Shuri, and the 2 children, the redheaded children. You might have seen their photos over the past 15 months. Ariel was 4 at the time that he was taken hostage. Their youngest son, Kfir, was 9 months old at the time. Now it's been more than 15 months. Their fates are not clear. Hamas has claimed at times that the wife and the 2 children were killed. They actually made Yarden put a hostage video together yelling at the Israeli government for killing them that Hamas claimed was an airstrike. Nonetheless, he returns home to some family members, but with the news that his wife and children are not there, and it's unclear what their fate is. So that's one storyline we'll be watching here in the coming days with the additional releases. As for one of the last Americans who was released, Keith Siegel, he's a North Carolina native. He immigrated to Israel in the 80s, working as an occupational therapist. We're actually, Alex and I are close friends with his niece, who has been working on his release night and day for the last year and a half, meeting at the White House, with the State Department, the media. Her name is Hannah. So we're happy that the Siegels finally, after all this time, are reunited. As
more and more of these hostages come out, they're looking, unfortunately, worse, to be in worse condition. And of course, it's hard to tell just from television how someone is doing, but he noticeably thinner, pale. So happy that he is home, and I hope he's doing okay.
So now that leaves 79 hostages in Gaza, 35 of which are presumed dead, according to Israeli authorities, according to Hamas claims. And this will then get us to this next phase of the deal. Many of the hostages that remain are Israeli soldiers. The price Hamas will ask for them in terms of prisoners, senior Hamas officials in Israeli prisons, they expect it to be much steeper. They've been getting about 30 to 40 prisoners for every Israeli they release. That's what Hamas has been asking for. That's what the Israelis have agreed to. So we'll see what happens. The Israelis increasingly are not sure whether they'll get to that second phase of the deal here, but that's something we'll be watching. Separately, Trump had a conversation over the weekend with the Egyptian president, al-Sisi, where he continues to push them. We told you about this last week in taking in a number of Palestinian refugees from Gaza. So far, Egypt, other Arab countries have refused to do so. They fear instability from the Palestinian population. They also just don't want to deal with it. And they fear that some of these people will never go back to Gaza, and they'll have to take them in permanently. But Trump has been pushing the Jordanians and Egyptians in particular, saying, hey, we give you a couple $1 billion a year in aid. We have a bunch of manufacturing, military manufacturing that happens in your countries. And as we told you earlier, Trump feels he can use various leverage to get countries to do what he wants. So that's another storyline we'll be watching out of the region.
And in much lighter news from CBS.
Finally.
From CBS, Punxsutawney Phil is predicting 6 more weeks of winter after seeing his shadow at Gobbler's Knob on Sunday morning. The good news is that Phil, not always right. Actually, he's wrong most of the time. He only has a 30% accuracy rate over the past decade. The better predictor is Staten Island Chuck. He has been right 85% of the time. And guess what? He did not see his shadow. He is predicting an early spring in 2025. Chuck, by the way, among the 17 other groundhogs across the country that also joined the festivities on February 2nd.
Everybody's got a groundhog. Of course, the rules are the same for every groundhog across the country. If you see the shadow, 6 more weeks of winter. If you don't see the shadow, you get an early spring. In many cases, you have a lot of media with lights. It's early morning. Who knows how this all works? But actually, NOAA, the government agency, keeps track of all this. They ran the numbers, and we posted the rankings yesterday. Out of the 18 groundhogs that we most closely follow, Phil's success rate, 17 out of 18. I guess it's just the movie that's made Phil the most famous, and he was one of the first ones. Nonetheless, 35% accuracy rate according to NOAA in recent years. You mentioned Staten Island Chuck. He's got an 85% success rate. So Chuck, early spring. Phil, late spring. Like we're going to have 6 more weeks of winter. Then in second place behind Chuck with an 80% success rate is General Beauregard Lee of Georgia. Now, that groundhog, with his success rate at number 2, he went with Phil. So he also saw his shadow and predicts 6 more weeks of winter. So we have Chuck, early spring at 85% success rate. We have General Beauregard Lee, saw his shadow, 6 more weeks of winter. So this is a fight here between Chuck and Beauregard, the general, over basically bragging rights this year. Who's going to get it right? They're split. Nonetheless, if you look at the actual weather forecasters, not the groundhogs, they think we are looking at an earlier spring here based on some of the trend lines they're seeing. So, Jill, that's the good news out of all this.
And Moshe, we'll take it.
More than you ever thought you would learn about the groundhogs.
At least nobody got bit this time around.
Yeah, well, that's our friend Staten Island Chuck. He bit Mike Bloomberg several years ago. All right, we end here with On This Day in History. On this day in 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution granting Black American men the right to vote was ratified. Which brings us to the 20th century in morning show news. On this day in 1953, a chimpanzee named J. Fred Muggs joined the Today Show. Yes, you heard that right. In the 1950s, one of the co-hosts was a chimp. Notably, because I helped relaunch the CBS Morning Show back in 2011, Jill, we looked into the history of the CBS Morning Show. And it turns out that while the Today Show had their chimp, their like real life chimp, over on the CBS Morning Show in the 1950s, someone you might have heard of named Walter Cronkite, who was a young anchor on the morning show back then, his co-host, a puppet named Charlemagne the Lion. So the morning shows back in the 50s, just a little weird.
They're still a little weird. It's just different.
Just like you don't have a real life puppet and a chimp on set, but
they're still doing weird stuff.
They're still doing weird stuff on the morning show. That's why you listen to this podcast. All right. Famous day in American history, February 3rd. You might also know this day as the day the music died. Rock and roll stars Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson, died in a small plane crash near Clear Lake, Iowa. It was commemorated in the Don McLean song American Pie, of which I should note my wife and my mother-in-law know all the lyrics to, going through like, I think it's like 6 or 7 different verses. So they like to sing, and then they'll remind, so they like to sing it, and like they go through all the verses. A little bit more music news on this day. On this day in 1973, Crocodile Rock, one of Elton John's huge hits. He had quite a run there in the early 70s. This reached number 1 on this day in 1973. And one more song hitting number 1 today in 2001. It Wasn't Me by Shaggy. Shaggy.
I was going to attempt to do the Crocodile Rock, like, it's just...
People are like, why? What is up with you and Jill today? You begin the podcast with colonoscopy talk. Then you're like trying to imitate Crocodile Rock at the end. We'll give you one more shot, you two.
Yes, please forgive us and keep listening. If for some reason this is the first time you've ever listened, this isn't how it usually goes.
I hope you're listening at this point still.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. Really, it helps us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and throw us a kind review in the App Store. It really helps. 5
stars. We deserve it. Leave us a review. It was National Compliment Day recently, so if you didn't honor National Compliment Day, we told you about it on the podcast. One way to do it, leave us a great review over there in the Apple App Store. See ya.
And Moshe, good luck to you.
Thank you, Jill.